Today, yeah, we'll concentrate, on, kind of talking about, the United States, the fact we got to finish off Japan. Germany is pretty much knocked out of the war at this point by May, 1945. So we'll get into that. And then I'll kind of get into the Cold War. We'll kind of at least talk about the origins of the Cold War, kind of how it gets started, more or less. And last class, of course, I think we had talked about how, the fact that the Germans had surrendered in Europe. I think we talked about VE Day or Victory in Europe Day, which the dates for that vary. I think commonly the common date is May 8th, 1945. But it kind of depends on who's fighting, I guess. I know on May 7th, May 8th, pretty much in those days, the Germans began surrendering to the British and the Americans. And then by May 9th, a day later, actually, Germans surrendered to the Soviet Union. So I think in Russia today, VE Day is actually May 9th. All depends on what time zone you're in and all that. A lot of these dates, more or less. Now, of course, we're going to get into today. I'm going to talk about the Pacific campaign where, the United States takes on Japan, which, the war in the Pacific was a war which lasted, by the way, from 1941 to 1945. There's different names for it, too. We'll call it Pacific Campaign. Pacific War is often a common name, too. We'll call it, or Pacific Theater, if you want to call it that also as well. But obviously it started with what was basically Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor got attacked on December 7th, 1941, that's what started it. But pretty much the other powers like Britain and others were fighting Japan already. China was fighting them too, going back to 1937. So pretty much the war in Asia went back a bunch of years before we really got directly involved in it. Now, the first big conflict that we really get involved in, we study about the Pacific campaign, was the Battle of Midway, which you can see the dates took place between June the 4th to the 7th, 1942. Midway is important. It's considered one of the turning point battles in World War II. It's also considered one of several aircraft carrier battles that were big in the Pacific. I think it was like 5 or 6 big ones that they had. They were pretty important because, the war was different like in the Pacific because you had a lot of islands in the Pacific Ocean. And so use of aircraft carriers were pretty important. Why Midway? Like if you study about Midway, I do have a map showing you kind of the region of the Pacific region here, the map here. But if you go to this huge map here, you can see that Midway was located about halfway between what is, I guess, Japan and almost Hawaii. And so in the Central Pacific here, and the Japanese in 1942 wanted to take control of Midway so then that they could push on to take Hawaii. You can see that Japanese had a huge ring that they had kind of conquered and developed here from, China down into Southeast Asia. You can see all the areas they conquered, by the way, the Japanese at one point, from Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, where Vietnam is, into Malaysia, all the way into part of New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Mariana Islands, the Philippines. So obviously their next step was to take Hawaii here. And so what happened was the U.S. forces, we were outnumbered heavily at Midway, like 4-1 on the battle. And the U.S. forces our naval forces were able to, using our bombers from aircraft carriers, we were able to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at one point, which were actually 4 that were at what is Pearl Harbor, and they attacked them. Which you see the Kaga, Hagaki, Soryu, and Hiryu were all sunk in the battle. And that was kind of considered a turning point because Japanese lost a lot of aircraft carriers and pilots that were pretty important in the war. that helped to, attack us in the beginning, basically. I guess Yamamoto's right that it would only maybe 6 months. Maybe they do pretty good, and then they start losing, of course, after that. And so Midway was very important. Some people call it the miracle at Midway because we were able to, defeat them, with less forces because, we had lost so much at Pearl Harbor because of our capital ships being sunk or damaged at that point. You can see from this map here, by the way, that the United States then after that created a new policy to try and defeat the Japanese in the Pacific, which they call it either island hopping or leapfrogging. And this was an idea to use like the U.S. Navy with like the Marines, also U.S. Army forces. And what they would do is they would take back, strategic islands that were in the Pacific and then bypass others that were, less important with this. And if you study about the Pacific, they had two main commanders that were kind of part of it. That were involved. You had MacArthur, who of course was with the U.S. Army, who had been forced to evacuate the Philippines in 1941. And so he had his own ideas. And then, of course, the head of the Pacific Fleet was Admiral Chester Nimitz, of course, with the U.S. Navy. He had his own ideas, also what he wanted to do. Nimitz favored attacking through the Central Pacific. He believed that the strategic islands that were important were like the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the Mariana Islands, especially that last one right there you're looking at. And so, yeah, you can see this map here. They wanted to kind of drive through this way and go more towards the Central Pacific, from this way, that way, towards Japan. However, of course, on the other side, MacArthur had his own ideas. MacArthur wanted to drive through the Southern Pacific and take Solomon Islands back, New Guinea. They're kind of worried about Australia being taken by the Japanese, believe it or not. And Peleliu Islands, I think, was another one they wanted to go after. And then the Philippines. So he wanted to drive up more Southern Pacific from like Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands this way, and then go up this way and attack them from the south. So that was kind of what they were trying to do, basically. So, yeah, that's kind of what they did. That's kind of, they kind of both did at the same time. MacArthur was kind of a jerk, but he was a great general, But kind of talk about our first offensive battle that's kind of important in of course, the Pacific. First one they really talk about, which is really important, is the Battle of Guadalcanal, which took place between 1942 to 1943. Guadalcanal, by the way, was an important island that was part of the Solomon Islands chain. Talk about the slot. It was in that area, all those different islands that are around there. Anyway, the Japanese were going to use Solomon Islands to basically control New Guinea, and then from there maybe hop to Australia as well. And it caused a 6-month-long battle where the U.S. forces were brought in, which were Marines. U.S. Marines were involved in this. And the Japanese, who were, by the way, heavily outnumbered in the battle, the two sides fought it out from August 1942 to February of 1943. It's really one of the first famous Marine battle, probably in World War II, you'll hear about. And they eventually overwhelmed them. But like I said, it was like an island of death because a lot of the Japanese soldiers, they wouldn't surrender, basically. And that's something you see a lot, throughout a lot of battles that come later also as well. Other battles that were also strategic too, they talk about, we go back, I don't think I've got one right here, but if you look at here, which is the Battle of Tarawa. It's another famous Marine battle, which was fought about right here in what is called the Gilbert Islands. So after Solomon Islands were retaken, also New Guinea, they also take back Tarawa, which is right here. And Tarawa took place in November of 1943. So from there, they began to take those islands, and they would push westwards, towards the Mariana Islands that are there. Those end up being probably more important if you read about World War II and the Pacific campaigns. You You got Operation Forager, so-called Battle of the Mariana Islands, I think they usually called it, which involved numerous battles that were important, where they took back the island of Saipan, Guam, Tinian as well, which took place, you can see, in the summer of 1944. Why are those battles important? Well, those islands end up being pretty important because the United States would use those to create bomber bases there, where they could then bomb Japan from the air. And so they brought in these new bombers that were called B-29s. The B-29 Superfortress was probably the best U.S. bomber they built in World War II. And they would fly these planes, of course, to Japan, bomb them from the air. Then, of course, later they would also drop the atomic bomb on them as well, flying mostly from Tinian there. So that's why they were important, those islands, and getting those. Later I'll talk about Iwo Jima, why they want that one, but it has a lot to do with that too, also as well. Then they had, of course, the other thing that happened too, which is very famous in the Pacific War as well. MacArthur later would go on to take the Philippines, which I don't know if you know, in 1941, he had made this famous statement where he would say, "I shall return," that kind of thing, when he was forced out. And so 1944-45, they had the Battle of the Philippines that took place, by the way, where we retook that series of islands that are there, which the taking of the Philippines, I don't know. There's some people think that was kind of controversial, like it wasn't really necessary. And it ended up causing, a lot of casualties on both sides. Also, a lot of Filipinos were killed too, civilians, in the conflict. It is known for like a naval battle, which was very famous, which if you go to this map here, there was a battle which was called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I think it's pretty much right there in that image. You can see it. It's about right here next to the Philippines, to the east of the Philippines, right here. And that was considered one of the most famous naval battles of the Pacific War, I guess outside of Midway. And it was considered the largest naval battle ever fought in World War II. Some people even think in world history, with the amount of men, I guess, involved in it. Almost 400 ships combined on both sides. Like the U.S. had over 300 ships that were involved, which I think we had like something like 30 carriers or more that we had in the battles, fleet and light carriers and all that. And at Leyte, which is very famous, if you know about it, the Japanese started using kamikaze pilots. This went on from 1944 to 45. Something like 4,000 pilots of the Japanese did this with suicide planes where they tried to attack U.S. naval ships. And you can see something like they sank at one point, 34 ships were sunk at one point. They damaged over almost 400 right there. And 7,000 to 8,000 sailors were actually killed on a lot of these naval vessels. Now, if you know much about Baton Rouge, they have the USS Kidd. It was actually attacked, I think, in that battle. One of those, I think it was Okinawa, I believe it was, where they got hit by a kamikaze. So, and the word kamikaze, by the way, meant divine wind. And so the Japanese thought that, they could turn these battles around by using these suicide planes. But in the end, it just made it more hell, trying to basically defeat the Japanese. And of course, like I said, the Japanese were known for not wanting to surrender because they believed in a thing called the Code of Bushido, where they thought it was honorable to die for the emperor. They thought that surrendering was cowardly. Now, later, of course, what happened, which is very famous about World War II in the Pacific for the Americans, they had, of course, the famous Battle of Iwo Jima. That's sure everybody's heard about. It's probably considered one of the most famous battles associated with our side of World War II in the Pacific. And it was called Operation Detachment, you can see there. And what happened was the U.S. forces using Marines, eventually seized the island with an amphibious assault. And the reason why they wanted to take Iwo Jima was because they could use it then as a support for bombers, because there was a deal where, say, a B-29 got damaged. Well, where could they, I guess, stop off? They had to sit there and have an emergency landing. So that's why they took the island, in case bombers need to come in that were damaged. And so it became one of the fiercest battles that we fought, of course, in the Pacific. And of course, it's one of the most famous, battles in like it's in the Marine Corps hymn, and all that today. And U.S. Marines suffered something like 26,000, by the way, well, like the amount of casualties with it. And the Japanese themselves, refused to surrender. I think most of them fought to the death, like we talked about. Only about 200 men actually surrendered on the Japanese side. And about Iwo Jima, it's known for the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, which was this volcano that's on the island on one side. And it was taken by this American photographer named Joe Rosenthal. And so there's also a video of it too, as well. And 6 men actually lifted it, as into place. 3 were killed in the battle. One of them was named Ira Hayes, who got the Congressional Medal of Honor for it. He was a Native American from Arizona. And so that became one of the most iconic pictures ever taken, really, during the Pacific War. It's one of the most famous. Of course, they now have a monument, for it in Washington, D.C. Of course, they've made statues out of it, pictures out of it, and all kinds of things. So it is, one of the most iconic pictures, ever taken, in World War II. It's kind of a sad story about Ira Hayes, but he died young at 32 because he was a bad alcoholic, and you can understand why. A lot of these battles were horrific that they really fought in. Then they had, of course, one more battle they fought that they always talk about, which, of course, is Okinawa. And Okinawa was really the last hurrah of the Japanese trying to hold off the Americans as they, pushed through the Pacific. And it's called Operation Iceberg. It took place over something like 82 days. This battle, almost something like 3 months. To seize Okinawa. Why was Okinawa important? Well, it was this basically a Japanese home island that they had. They were going to try to use it to basically springboard to invade Japan and take it. And Okinawa, by the way, involved 1,300 something naval vessels of the United States, 250,000 U.S. Army troops and Marines were also involved. The Japanese had about 100,000 troops that were entrenched on the island of Okinawa, and it became a bloody battle. If you know much about Okinawa, the Japanese, were tenacious. They didn't want to surrender, and so basically they had to go from each part of the island and just kill them all, just about, or use flamethrowers to take them out. I think the amount of casualties, by the way, was something like 50,000 that the Americans suffered on Okinawa. It's one of our bloodiest battles that we ever fought in the Pacific. It's bloodier than Okinawa. It's bloodier than Iwo Jima. I think Philippines is a little bloodier, though, than Iwo Jima. And it was also the largest amphibious invasion, by the way, in the Pacific, of course, outside of D-Day that we had. So, yeah, Okinawa, it's important because, we were thinking that we might be able to use that to springboard. And they were talking about this operation that they were going to develop later that was called Operation Downfall, was what it was going to call. That's what they called it. And I think George C. Marshall was starting to work on it. And they thought that something like 500,000 or more Americans might get killed trying to take Japan, because Japan was talking about fighting to the death when we invaded. So that's the next thing, of course, we're going to talk about, of course, which is famous about World War II, as you know. is that the United States would eventually develop the atomic bomb. It's one of the things that would help to, end World War II, more or less. And what happened was the United States came up with the atomic bomb, which was part of the so-called Manhattan Project. That was very secretive, the United States. And this was a U.S. Army project that I think the British were involved in it and other scientists. And the idea was to create a super weapon that could basically end the war. And I think the original idea of it was to basically, was really to use it on Germany, was what we were going to do, like bomb Berlin or whatever and take out Hitler. But the war was over, and so Japan ended up getting bombed instead with this new kind of weapon. They say that the actual weapon, the idea of it was Einstein's idea. Albert Einstein was the one who came up with the idea for it because he had heard that the Germans were doing the same thing. I think in Norway, the Germans have been trying to build like an atomic weapon using heavy water. And so he realized that if they didn't do something about it, they might get the jump on us. Japan did it too. They were working on a bomb as well. So a lot of people were kind of doing this at about the same time. The Manhattan Project, by the way, was run by this general who was part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who was Leslie Groves. And Groves, by the way, had been the famous engineer that had helped design and construct the Pentagon building, which is in Washington, D.C., which is the main U.S. defense building that's there today. And Groves would later be put in charge, of the Manhattan Project. There's a great movie about that if you ever want to watch it, which is called Fat Man and Little Boy, which Paul Newman's is in it. He kind of acts as, Leslie Groves. But anyway, the Manhattan Project, why was it called Manhattan? It was called that because they did some early experiments with the bomb, I think in like Columbia University, which is on Manhattan Island, New York City. And so that's why they called it that. But they had all kinds of different secret locations where they did different experiments and so on. I think in Tennessee, I think they worked on some of the uranium, plutonium to refine it and all that as an example. Now, they had a headquarters, though, Los Alamos, as you know, New Mexico. That became the headquarters of where the Manhattan Project, of course, was. And also, of course, they began to build the bombs there as well. And what exactly is an atomic bomb, by the way? What are we talking about? Of course, that eventually gets constructed, which you can see two bombs that are right here. Well, atomic bomb is like a nuclear type weapon. And of course, this one was a fission type nuclear weapon that they built, which was made from using uranium and plutonium, those elements. And of course, it creates a massive chain reaction explosion from minimal material that creates these huge mushroom clouds that you see, of course, with it. Of course, some of them later have like a more of a bubble shape. I really thought that in that video where they were showing like the first bomb going off, that was more like a hydrogen bomb, which is like more like a big bubble when it blows up, versus the more fission bombs, which are more like a mushroom cloud going straight up instead. Of course, the ones they got now, the hydrogen bombs are really bad. I think they're must be like 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. If they ever use those, we're dead. Like the whole world will be fried, pretty much. The man that designed it, by the way, was famous, of course. If you ever heard of Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, was the man that basically helped design and build the bombs. He was an American physicist at the University of California at Berkeley, and so-called, father of the atomic bomb. That's a good nickname to have. And eventually, he's the one who helped design a lot of the first two bombs that would be built at Los Alamos. And so eventually it led to them actually building the first bomb, which I don't think I've got a picture of that one that I've got. It looked kind of similar to more like the one on the top, but it was more round shaped. And they called it the Gadget. That's what they nicknamed it. By the way, it was very secretive about, what they were building. Most people that worked on the project unless they were high up, scientists or whatever, they didn't know what they were building. People say, what are we building? We're building the gadget, I think is what they would say. And so hence they got the name that they used for it. And the first bomb was actually tested in New Mexico near Alamogordo in July of 1945. It was called the so-called Trinity test, as they talked about in the video. It was put on that 100-foot tower they talked about, and they blew it up. And of course, they didn't know what was going to happen, by the way, when it exploded. It was kind of, nobody knew because they'd never done it before. And of course, after it was successful, they realized that they now had this terror weapon that they had. And Oppenheimer said it best, by the way, that he said, now I have become the destroyer of worlds, I think is what his famous comment was. He realized that he now had this terror weapon that could, really blow up the world, change everything. So they end up, like I said, building those two bombs. They didn't really have any other bombs, by the way, to use on Japan except those two, which were Fat Man and Little Boy, as you see in the picture. By the way, Little Boy was a uranium bomb and Fat Man was a plutonium bomb. Those are the different elements that they used with those bombs. If you know about Little Boy, which is very famous, Little Boy was actually shipped across the Pacific, like the parts for it and all that, on this ship called the USS Indianapolis. And as you know, after they delivered the bomb, what happened was Japanese submarines sank it. And because I guess everything was so secretive about the bomb, they couldn't tell everybody where the location, where it went down. And so a lot of men died. They either drowned or they got eaten by sharks. It's a very famous story about that. I think in the movie Jaws, they talk about that. All the men that get eaten by sharks. And so, yeah, kind of a lot of men died to get this bomb, across the Pacific and all that. So, yeah, they ended up, of course, dropping the first bomb, on Japan, which the famous plane, of course, that bombed Japan was the so-called Enola Gay that they always talk about. Here's the crew, by the way, of the Enola Gay that they didn't show, I guess, in the video. Maybe a little bit of that. But there's Paul Tibbets in the middle. He was the actual pilot that captained, of course, the Enola Gay, which probably is the most famous plane ever really in World War II. It's in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And most of the crew, by the way, didn't know what they were going to do until they were close to the target. And so that was the plane that would drop the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima. Like I said, Hiroshima was the main target because it was a military target. Also, the fact that they also had a big armaments industry there as well. They wanted to take out. And so that bomb would end up killing, like I said, over 100,000 people instantly when, of course, it blew up. And yeah, you can see the devastation from here. Of course, the picture of the actual picture from the mushroom. You can see that on August 6th that was taken from the Enola Gay. You can see, yeah, it's traditional mushroom cloud that a lot of the early bombs, of course, had from that time. Yeah, most of Hiroshima was wiped out, except for, like I said, those concrete buildings, of course, that were left over. You can see a better picture with the color right there. Yeah, there's a very good book on that by John Hersey that was later made into a novel, which kind of goes into the details of how horrible it was and the people that survived it afterwards. There were actually a few people that survived Hiroshima, and they actually fled to Nagasaki, and they got bombed there twice by an atomic bomb. Yeah, it's true. It's weird about that. Crazy. But so, yeah, that's basically the first bomb they had. They had a second bomb also they talked about too, which was Fat Man. That was dropped 3 days later, of course, on Nagasaki, which was dropped by another B-29 called Boxcar, if you get the name on the play on the name. Some guy named Bach was the pilot, just like Boxcar. But they killed something like 80-something thousand. And so both bombs combined, they think may have killed as many as 200,000 people or more. Some people died instantly, and some people died later of radiation poisoning, of course, which is something that comes from these bombs as a whole. Now, Japan, would then surrender afterwards. It wasn't just because of the bombs. that made them surrender. If you know about it, right after they dropped the second bomb, Fat Man, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. So they were kind of concerned that the Soviets are going to come in and take some of the Japanese islands, especially in the north. And so they decided to surrender before that happens. And so on August the 15th, 1945, the Japanese began surrendering all throughout the Pacific, throughout Asia, to other powers as well. And so that became known as VJ Day, or Victory over Japan Day. It does depend on where you are, because you got that international date line that kind of goes through the Pacific, but depending on where you are, it's either August 15th or August 14th. I think in America, maybe in the 14th, I believe it was. But basically, that's the official date usually when the war kind of starts to come to an end. The Japanese, by the way, do not officially surrender until Tokyo Bay. That's on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri, where they sign off on papers to end the war officially. So September 2nd, sometimes 3rd too also, is usually considered to be the date when World War II actually comes to an end. So yeah, and Japan's going to get occupied, after the war. We'll kind of be involved in trying to redo Japan, and they end up actually becoming one of our closest allies in the world after, which is kind of funny about how that, of course, happened. Of course, get into and talk about some of the things that also happened, at the end of the war. At the end of World War II, by the way, the Allies, discovered atrocities that were committed by the Axis powers. Like in Europe, they had the Holocaust, where Hitler and the Nazi regime, killed a lot of Jews, like European Jewish population. They discovered Auschwitz, as you know, and other like so-called concentration death camps, of course, that were there. So we had that. They had, of course, those Nuremberg trials you may have heard about, where a lot of Nazis were put on trial, including, I think, Hermann Goering was one of the most highest-ranking Nazis that were put on power, eventually were executed for it, I think, and some were put in prison as well. Oh, Japan had a lot of people that were also put on trial as well, because they had committed atrocities against the Allies. The Japanese were notorious for treating their POWs really bad. I think under them, a lot of them actually died in captivity, or they even had some executed, cut their heads off. And the prime minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo, was later executed after the war, I think in 1946. So yeah, that's kind of like the end of the war. World War II, was very bloody. They think as many as 60 million people may have died in World War II. The amount of American casualties we had in the war was like 400,000 Americans died in the war. So compared to other countries, we didn't have as many casualties compared to, Germany, Soviet Union, or Japan, who lost a lot of people during the war. Now, I'm going to move on next. We're going to, of course, talk about have some time that I'm going to kind of get into and talk about also the so-called Cold War that they have that comes in, because that's one thing that's really something that kind of, occurs right after the Cold War, after World War II ends, and this event comes in with that. Yeah, you can see the Cold War lasted roughly from the 1940s. It's kind of a debate about when it started, but it goes up to like around 1991. So we'll be talking about a lot about this week and next week. The Cold War itself started mostly under the Harry S. Truman administration, who was president of the United States starting in April of 1945. That was because Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12th in, I think, Hot Springs, Georgia. And he had been serving in power since 1933. People were kind of used to him being president, and so people were kind of shocked when his vice president, who was from Missouri, Truman, became president. He was a Democrat, and I think a lot of people, he was actually unpopular, believe it or not, at least at that time. But Truman ends up being a very successful president, they think, especially dealing with the Cold War early on. Here's Truman right here who would be president of the United States from 1945 to 1953. He became president, by the way, on April 12th, 1945, when Roosevelt died, of course, in office. Now, let's talk about the Cold War, of course, the early aspect of it, in of course, what occurred. And like, what exactly is the Cold War? Let's kind of talk about that first. Like, what exactly was it, more or less? Well, the Cold War, you can see there was this confrontation and competition that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union. A lot of people see it as a geopolitical struggle that occurred. It involved not just those two sides, like U.S. and Soviet Union, like the only superpowers kind of left after World War II that you got. But it's also their prospective allies that were kind of on each side. Like the Soviets were kind of aligned with other powers in Europe, et cetera, that were communist. You also got the Chinese later that were communist. Then you got, of course, the Western powers like France and Britain, et cetera, NATO. That's also on one side that you have. You can see you've got those that are democratic or capitalist, of course, that were against those that were communist. So they often call the countries in the West the so-called Western Bloc, of course. And those in the East were called the Eastern Bloc, especially those in Europe that you had. And later you also had, by the 1950s, you had also communist states in Asia like China, North Korea, North Vietnam. Later you can add Cuba in there too as well. They also had Yugoslavia that was communist as well, but Yugoslavia was actually kind of in line with the West, which is kind of weird in the Cold War. The Cold War also ushered in this nuclear arms race, which you can see there was also a big problem they had. And so, yeah, the Cold War was this gloomy period where everybody thought that nuclear war was going to happen and that the world was going to be destroyed. And so I remember when I was a kid, having to do all these like drills where we would go in the hallway or we duck and roll, just preventing, thinking that they were going to get blown up by an atomic bomb. I think now they do tornado drills, I guess now, whatever they do. But back in the day when I was living at the end of the Cold War, I'm 50 years old, so I kind of remember all this. So yeah, that was like a different time period compared to now. So, Albert Einstein, made a famous quote I sometimes talk about, which he summed it up. He said, "I don't know what kind of weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV," he said, "will be fought with sticks and stones." So a lot of people thought that, if they did have a nuclear war, that everybody be dead, is what would happen, especially with the hydrogen bomb when they started developing by the 1950s, and all that. The term Cold War, there's different theories on who developed it. There's one main guy they always kind of give credit for developing the term Cold War, which was George Orwell. He actually had a statement about that he actually had in a little newspaper article in 1945, which was a little newspaper article. You can see they're called "You and the Atomic Bomb." And Orwell was the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, which a lot of these books were geared towards criticizing communism, the fact that it was, political failure. Anyway, he made the statement that basically he thought that these new nuclear weapons that they're dropping on Japan is going to create eventually a nuclear war, like a war between both sides, like East and West. And he says that it's a peace that is no peace, which he called it a permanent Cold War that might break out, between different sides if everybody gets an atomic bomb, that kind of deal. So that's something to really think about, later about the Cold War. And like I said, the Cold War goes on for roughly about 4 or 5 decades until really, I guess, the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, Germany was eventually unified together as one state again. Because I'll get to it later, they occupy it, and divide it up and all that, of course, after Germany is defeated in the war. Now, I did want to talk about the United Nations a little today. The United Nations is something that kind of helped to kind of start the Cold War, they believe. If you know about the UN, it was created at the end of World War II by the winning Allied powers. In fact, they called it United Nations because that was like their nickname of what they called themselves. We are the United Nations against the Axis powers, etc. And it was a type of organization, that replaced the League of Nations, which had not been that successful. And it's just like the United Nations. It was basically a international government peace organization like the League was. And it was basically designed as this international governmental type system, which countries could, create peace diplomatically rather than using war. And you can see its headquarters. Originally, I think it was San Francisco where they founded it in 1945, but after that, they later moved it to New York City in New York. That's the famous United Nations building that's there today. It was founded, by the way, by the Big Five. That's what they call, by the way, the five winning allies, the major ones anyway, in World War II. United States, Great Britain, France, at the time, Republic of China, when it was founded, and in the Soviet Union. Those are all the countries, of course, that basically founded it initially. And if you know much about the UN, it has two main parts to it that are important. They got the General Assembly. That's where basically they would kind of arbitrate and discuss issues, and any dictator can show up and make a speech, which is true. It's crazy. And then, of course, they got the Security Council that they've got that actually maintains the policies of the General Assembly and UN. And it has 15 members that are on the Security Council. It has like 5 permanent members that are part of it, which are, of course, the big 5 that they have that we just talked about. And what happens every year, they add 10 different states. They kind of rotate it, basically. And the Security Council is very important. It's the main principal organ of the United Nations, and it enforces a lot of the UN policies. And one thing that's kind of important about the Cold War era, more or less, is that if you know about the Big Five, they all have vetoes, right? They can veto each other and all that. And so that's part of why the Cold War was such a conflict. Because like the Security Council, you had this deal where the Western Bloc countries, USA, Britain, France, could veto, right? Well, so could the Soviets and Chinese. They were communist, the Eastern Bloc. And so that's part of why, it was such a big conflict, the UN. They had a lot of arguments, and like Khrushchev showed up one time, I know, took his shoe off, banged it on the podium and said, "We will bury you." And I think there was also that other thing, Adlai Stevenson, remember, if you heard the story about that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he asked the Soviets, I'm waiting for your answer till the hell freezes over, about whether you got missiles there, on Cuba. So yeah, a lot of tension, between both sides, of course, in the UN. The UN was also involved in a lot of early things, which kind of are important later. Like the UN is involved in, of course, the whole Arab-Israeli wars were all started because of the UN. Because the UN decided to take what is Palestine and divide it up, and it led to the state of Israel forming, and that sparked the Arab-Israeli wars. That was one thing I know. That's like one of the first things they were famous kind of for doing. It was kind of controversial, by the way. And then the UN intervened in Korea, the Korean conflict, when North Korea invaded South Korea. They were involved in that and got us, the United States, to kind of come in and, of course, intervene under Douglas MacArthur. So we'll get to that later about that. Now, I want to get in and also talk about like the origins of the Cold War. Like why did the East West why did they split and all that with the Cold War? So we'll kind of talk about like what happened, like the origins of it and all that. Well, yeah, a lot of the Cold War doesn't just start with World War II. You can actually go back further, all the way back to the Russian Revolution. We didn't really get into this in this class. This is more of an American history class. But what happened was in Russia, 1917, they had the so-called Russian Revolution, where the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was overthrown. And what happened was, over time, radical socialists took over. They were called Bolsheviks. And they were led by this famous socialist named Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin seized power. And of course, they started calling themselves the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, since the term communist being used. And so from there, what happened was they went through like a civil war, which lasted about 3 years or so, which was very bloody. And then from there, you got the Soviet Union that emerged in 1922, also called the USSR. And so the USSR will be around for something like almost 70 years until 1991. And the Americans for years never trusted the Soviet Union. We were always concerned that the Soviets were going to try to spread communism to the rest of the world. We had all these Red Scares, like you had the first Red Scare after World War I. They later had one after World War II. In the late 40s and early 50s, they had also, there was a lot of mistrust towards Joseph Stalin, who took over after Lenin died in the Soviet Union. He was like a totalitarian dictator for almost 30 years. And so he also helped to increase tensions in the Cold War. He's really one of our first Soviet leaders that we really face during the Cold War. And what happened was at the end of the Cold War, at the end of World War II, into the Cold War, the Soviets actually overran Eastern Europe, took it over. And you can see that they ended up, taking over all these countries: East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania. All those countries end up getting overrun and become communists. They even influenced communism in Asia, spread like North Korea. They influenced the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and so on. And so they're trying to spread communism, all over the world at that point. And so people start, realizing that there's this now them versus us, they talk about. And one of the things that happened that's very famous, Truman eventually they think that it's kind of a debate about when the Cold War started. Some people think 1946, 47 is about right. But Truman went to this speech that Winston Churchill gave. He was giving a lecture at, I think, Westminster College, which was in, I think, Fulton, Missouri, I think is where it was. And he gave this speech, and he talks about how, Eastern Europe is becoming communist. And if you know about the famous thing that Churchill did, he came up with a famous common term that he started using, which was Iron Curtain. And the fact that basically, he said basically right there, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has ascended across the continent, was the famous quote that he said. So pretty much from Eastern Central Europe all the way to Russia, everything was going communist at that point. And so, what were we to do? There was kind of a debate about this, and people had different theories about how we should face against the communists. I know George S. Patton, if you know about that, who was a famous American general, wanted to fight the Soviets after the war ended. He later died mysteriously. Some people think he killed him because he wanted to do that. And then Truman later is going to come up with his own policies, which will be the Truman Doctrine, where they'll try to basically kind of contain it and try to prevent it from spreading, rather than trying to fight it, because they thought that if they did, it would cause World War III, because some people thought that was going to happen next between both sides. Let me get into and talk about one more thing today as well. Of course, we have to call, the so-called East-West split that they have that occurs, over Germany. And of course, one thing that does happen, which is very famous, as you know, is Germany gets occupied pretty much after the war. In fact, they often call that one of the main reasons why the Cold War started, was because of what happened with Germany. Compared to World War I, we didn't do that. We didn't occupy Germany. Maybe we should have after the war. But what happened, you can see how they began to divide it up into different occupation zones. You can see the different colors that are listed there. So you had Britain, France, U.S., and Soviet Union, were all the different allies that invaded Germany at one point. The Western powers, which were Britain, France, and the U.S., they would occupy the western part, like 3 zones you can see in the so-called orange, blue, and green areas. And they would actually create a state out of it eventually, which would be called West Germany, which was founded in 1949. was later called the Federal Republic of Germany. And so it was around for like 40 years or more. And West Germany was more like this capitalist democratic state that was backed by the United States and other Western powers. And so, and then of course the Soviets had their part, which was like in the northeastern part of Germany, which was where Berlin was, and they formed out of that East Germany between 1949 and 1990. They called it the German Democratic Republic. Nobody called it that, though. A lot of people call it West East Germany for both of them. And that one was more of a communist, socialist type state that was backed by the Soviet Union and other communist powers. And so you can see the differences between the two that are kind of dividing with Germany at that point. They stay that way till 1990, till they reunite the German country together. Of course, the weird thing about Germany, as you know, was that they divided Berlin too, like the capital. It was actually divided. West Berlin was occupied by France, Britain, and the USA, of course. And then East Berlin was divided, of course, by the Soviet Union. And later that becomes a major issue, of course, in the Cold War. A lot of people in the East, that were communists that wanted to get out or didn't like communism really, would use West Berlin to escape by the thousands. And so I'll get to it later. They actually built the so-called Berlin Wall, which was built around West Berlin to prevent people from escaping. And later the Berlin Wall becomes one of the most famous symbols, of the Cold War era. So, yeah, they think Germany is one of the major causes, of the Cold War starting out. But, yeah, there's other things. You got, you have also communism spreading to Asia. I'll get to the fact that in China, the People's Republic of China forms in 1949. You got North Korea becomes communist. That leads to the Korean War. You've also got North Vietnam. It also becomes communist as well. 1959, you got Cuba that becomes communist. So basically by the 1950s, you got communism spreading all over, Europe and also the world. And so that's a major issue. That's part of, what causes, the Cold War era. So I'll get more into that, next week. I think that's it pretty much for World War II era and at least the origins of the Cold War for today. But before I go, just a reminder, of course, you have a new assignment, of course, up, which is the second exam. So make sure y'all start working on that because I believe that is due next week sometime. I want to say Friday, April 23rd, I think is when it's due. But also don't forget, to start, uploading your research papers that y'all have got, the speed grader. I think some classes, I think, have it next week, I think, when it's due. But you want to go ahead and start uploading it early you can, more or less. But I will give you like a week to kind of upload them, by the way, from the actual due date, just to give you more time and also give me more time, of course, in grading them because it does take a while, of course, to do that. So that's it for the week. Hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. And so, like I said, next week we'll, of course, move on in American history to talk about the Cold War era. We'll kind of talk about the Truman, Eisenhower era and all that, of course, that happens in the 1940s and 50s. So y'all take care. I'll see y'all, of course, next week.